Hi there and welcome to the briefing room. I'm ABC News political director Rick Klein here in our Washington newsroom on this Friday. Great to have you with us. A lot of news to cover as the president wraps up in a campaign event last night, muses openly about actually purchasing a country, an interesting one that we're going to cover a little bit later in the program. But we want to start with the news out of Israel, where two Muslim American members of Congress have been barred entry into the country. They were planning to attend as part of an official trip. Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar are those two members of Congress. There was news overnight that Congresswoman Tlaib was going to be allowed into the country to visit her grandmother, who is 90 years old and lives in the West Bank. But she has since reversed course and said she is not going to visit after all. All of this coming after President Trump publicly urged the Israeli government to not allow them to enter the country. We're joined from the White House by our ABC News reporter, Jordan Phelps. And Jordan, it seems like the White House has walked kind of an interesting line on this. The president is on record having made this public urging. Their official position, though, is that that the president did not actually communicate with Netanyahu or the Israeli government in a formal way. Is that right?
Well, Rick, the president himself yesterday told reporters that he didn't exert influence on Israel not to let them in. But, Rick, it was just hours earlier that the president was on Twitter saying it'd be a terrible idea for Israel to let them into the country because of the terrible things he says they've said about Israel. So the president obviously did publicly exert influence, even though he doesn't want to be responsible for making that final decision.
And speaking of Twitter, Congresswoman Omar actually went on Twitter earlier today and tweeted out what would have been an itinerary, an attempt, of course, to show that she was there to learn, as members of Congress often do, talking about that she would have met with the U.S. ambassador as well as lawmakers who include both Israeli and Palestinian folks, people on all sides of the issue. She is being denied, of course, that opportunity by the Israeli government. We're joined now via Skype by Diala Shammas of the Center for Constitutional Rights. And Diala, I want to get your take on this because the Israeli government, obviously they're invoking their own law that allows them to, or requires them in their view, to bar entry to people that are committed to the so-called BDS movement. But what's your view of what this means and how unprecedented it is to have a U.S. lawmaker who isn't allowed into a U.S. ally?
Thank you for having me on the show. It is, in fact, unprecedented for a U.S. lawmaker to be denied into Israel in this way, but it is absolutely not unprecedented for Israel to deny entry to Palestinians who are Palestinian Americans, right? Americans of Palestinian origin, as well as Muslim Americans and others who it deems are coming to meet with Palestinians or who they deem to sympathize with Palestinians. This is actually not a new phenomenon. Israel has a very long history, a very well-documented history of denying entry to Palestinian Americans and educators who are trying to go and teach. For example, at Birzeit University, which is one of the biggest Palestinian universities north of Ramallah. This has been going on for decades. The thing that's different here is that historically, U.S. Department of State and certainly the branches of the executive have done what they could to advocate on behalf of U.S. citizens who are being discriminated against because of their national origin or because of their speech by a foreign government, in this case, the Israeli government. To have the President of the United States encourage the exclusion of not only a U.S. citizen, but a member of Congress, a member of the government, to be barred from Israel is really unprecedented and is deeply troubling.
And as we know, Congresswoman Omar was not going to be allowed to attend under any circumstance. It was a little different for Congresswoman Tlaib. She reached out to the State Department and asked on humanitarian grounds to be able to visit her 90-year-old grandmother, who, of course, is in poor health. What do you make of her decision, though, Diala, to say thanks but no thanks, that given the conditions that were going to be placed on her political speech, that she decided that she wouldn't be making the trip?
Watching the last 24 hours just via, Twitter and the news has been just so familiar, has felt so familiar to many Palestinians who have, on a daily basis, been forced to make decisions like the ones that Congresswoman Tlaib has been forced to make, choosing between your two important values is something that Palestinians have to do all the time. whether you can marry the person that you fall in love with because they happen to hold a residency of the West Bank, for example, if you're a resident of Jerusalem and having to leave your family in order to be with the person you love, or whether it is to accept labor as a construction worker to build a settlement because you have to feed your family, whereas the state of Israel has prevented you from accessing your historical farmland. Or whether you have to stay silent, witnessing abuse at a checkpoint in order to be able to pass through the checkpoint to pray at Al-Aqsa Mosque. These are all the kinds of dilemmas that Palestinians are placed in and faced with on a daily basis. And the only way to understand this, and this is something that is oftentimes lost on most Americans and those who aren't as familiar with the region, is you have to understand that Israel exercises complete and total and devastating control over every aspect of Palestinians' daily lives. It's not just at the borders, it's through the implementation of Kafka's permit system and regime, so that Palestinians, even from one part of the West Bank, have to move to another part of the West Bank or to access East Jerusalem, all of which are territories that are occupied, and not even to mention Gaza, which has been blockaded by Israel for the last 10 years. So Israel has dealt with Congresswoman Tlaib in the same way that it deals with all Palestinians, which is it might permit you to have some modicum of access to something that's important to you as long as you behave and as long as it can articulate a so-called humanitarian rationale. But that's actually not what the law requires. The law requires a lot more. Israel is obligated to allow Palestinians to thrive, right? Even Palestinians that live under occupation, remember Israel is an occupying power, Israel has to allow Palestinians and not violate their civil political rights. And those include their ability to meet with their family members, and those include their abilities to advocate on behalf of themselves for freedom and for justice.
Okay, Diala Shamas from the Center for Constitutional Rights. We appreciate you joining us here via Skype to talk about the story. Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And we want to move on to the president's rally last night, which, if you watched it, didn't make a lot of fresh headlines. Of course, a lot of stump speech about New Hampshire and about the importance of that. Corey Lewandowski, the president's campaign manager, did not get yet into the race for the United States Senate. But there was this pretty interesting moment where the president saw his speech interrupted by a protester. Take a look.
That guy's got a serious weight problem. Go home. Start exercising. Get him out of here, please. Got a bigger problem than I do. Got a bigger problem than all of us. Now he goes home and his mom says, "What the hell have you just done?"
So it turns out that what appeared to be a protester was actually a Trump supporter. And we have learned today that the president found that out after the rally, called him up, left a voicemail for that supporter. And according to our ABC News reporter, Will Steeken, who talked to the supporter, the president did not apologize, but that particular supporter says he had no reason to. He continues to be a big fan of President Trump. I want to get back Jordan Phelps over at the White House. And Jordan, the White House has gone out of its way to say that what the president called to offer was not an apology, even though the president was making fun of his weight.
Yeah, Rick, it was an unfortunate case of mistaken identity for the president here, but I guess you got to give him credit for one thing. He's done something that he doesn't often do, which is try to make amends for something he did wrong in calling that supporter. But as you note, he did not apologize to this supporter. He tells our reporters, but this supporter didn't seem to expect it. When he was asked if the president apologized, he said, "Why would he?" So it's very classic Trump behavior here. He doesn't apologize for much, but I guess at least he made that call, Rick.
I guess, although, of course, it still underlines the point. If this was a protester, he wouldn't have gotten a phone call. He only gets a phone call because he's a supporter of the president, the insult notwithstanding. Jordan, I want to move on to another story that I think has got a lot of people scratching their heads here in Washington, maybe laughing a bit out loud or listening to themselves. The news that the president has been using publicly about purchasing Greenland. Yes, Greenland. We've seen it on a globe. It's there in the Western Hemisphere. Pretty big country, about the size of Mexico, although it's a pretty small country by population, about 56,000 residents. This is an odd one, Jordan. And what is the White House saying? We've confirmed that the president has raised this as an issue, but how serious is it?
Yeah, Rick, what's unclear is whether the president is joking or not. What is interesting is from this reporting we've seen, not our own, is that according to at least the Wall Street Journal, the president actually tasked some members of the White House counsel's team to look into the possibility, which would suggest, if that is true, that it's more than just a joking matter. Rick, we know, of course, previous presidents, Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower, have in the past expressed interest in Greenland. It's important to note that there is some strategic importance to Greenland because of its position up there next to the Arctic, and China and Russia have increasingly been eyeing that region as well. So that might be one of the reasons we're interested in it militarily. At least we do have a base there. But certainly this is a head scratcher and one that's hard to know whether to take seriously or not, Rick.
Yeah, and of course it's got a fierce reaction in Greenland. Also, Denmark. Denmark controls Greenland. Greenland is a independent territory of Denmark. And the APTV, one of the ABC News partners, has actually gone around a little bit in Greenland and asked people what they thought of the president's suggestion. Take a look.
It feels as if he's very patronizing. It doesn't feel like he understands like the reality, and it's stupid.
He could buy anything, I guess, or this is what he thinks he can, but you can't. Sorry. I mean, it's the people, it's the country, it's a culture.
And for some perspective on this story, we're joined now by Paul Korup, who is the editor-in-chief of Sermitsiaq, a newspaper in Nuuk, Greenland. And Mr. Korup, I just want to get a sense of how this is playing with people, because a lot of people in the United States were surprised by this. What has been the reaction in your country?
The first reaction is that Greenland is not for sale. And the reaction is it is ridiculous that the President of the United States suggests such a thing.
Did it come totally out of the blue? Has there ever been talk about Denmark selling Greenland to someone? It seems like a ridiculous concept in 2019. I'm curious if it's ever come up in any coverage, in any conversation to your memory as a journalist.
No, not in any serious conversation. Of course, we have the old when Truman suggested it after the Second World War, but not since then. And Denmark is not in a position to sell Greenland. I mean, Denmark doesn't own Greenland. Greenland is an independent part of the Kingdom of Denmark, but Denmark doesn't own Greenland. It's impossible.
And give us a sense of what the relationship is between Greenland and Denmark. I know that Greenland has a good deal of independence, but what is the relationship with the country that at least nominally still has control? And is there any movement in Greenland, I'm curious, to have total independence or to have an association with another country?
Greenland wants to be independent of Denmark, and Greenland wants to decide who is going to be Greenland's future friends. But of course, there is a very close cooperation between Greenland and Denmark, and for the moment, the economy in Greenland is not strong enough to be completely independent. But there is a movement in Greenland, inside Greenland, towards complete independence.
Is there concern that the President of the United States musing aloud about this could impact the relationship between Greenland and the United States, between Denmark and the United States, to have the President on record on this, even in this strange sort of indirect way, that it will impact the way that the countries operate with each other?
Greenland would like to cooperate with the United States in several ways. Greenland wants a closer traffical connection with the United States. Greenland would like American companies to invest in Greenland and develop Greenland. But Greenland must be an independent part, and the United States must treat Greenland as an equal partner.
And our thanks to Mr. Karup for that perspective. Greenland, of course, raising another issue, that of global warming. When Greenland's in the news, it's often because of ice melt and because of new signs of global warming, climate change as a result of that. And there was a new study out just in the last couple of days that showed that the month of July was the hottest month on record. You have to go back well more than a century to find anything comparable in the records. We're joined now by Mark Serez, who's the director of National Snow and Ice Data Center. And Mr. Serez, I want to start with Greenland and how important it is and how it's viewed in the climate community as a critical place to study climate change and recognize the impacts.
Well, Greenland is one of the biggest contributors we have to sea level rise, and Greenland is losing mass. In other words, it's literally melting into the ocean, and that is raising sea level. So we're looking at it very closely, and we don't like what we're seeing.
And I'm curious, from your perspective, there are so many alarm bells that are sounding, and there's so many fresh headlines. When you see a new one, when you see a new high water mark, so to speak, or a new study that comes out that suggests that climate change is happening faster than anticipated, what is the reaction that you have to the way the news is received?
Well, my view is that every time we see something like we saw this summer in Greenland, this massive melt event, it's just an exclamation point of what we've already been seeing. And it's just ringing alarm bells to my mind that we need to start doing something about this, because this is a very, very real problem, and we see this happening before our very eyes.
Greenland, a country of only 56,000 people, how is it impacting the way of life in that country?
Well, certainly it's having impacts on the people that live there. They're having to deal with like massive runoff events. That is, you have a lot of melt, so you have big rivers. There's been cases where it's caused considerable damage to infrastructure, bridges, and things like that. So it's certainly affecting the people that live there. But of course, sea level rise is a global problem. So what's happening to Greenland really affects the rest of the world as well.
All right, using the issue in the president's interest to highlight a critical issue. Mark Serez, the director of the National Snow and Ice Data Center, we appreciate you joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
We're going to turn now to some news on the 2020 front. The field shrunk this week by one, John Hickenlooper getting out of the race. One candidate who's been rumored to be, at least talked about as a potential Senate candidate, not getting out of the race, though. That is Beto O'Rourke of Texas. He is back on the campaign trail today for the first time leaving his home state since he returned in the wake of that awful, tragic shooting of about 2 weeks ago in his hometown of El Paso, Texas. He was in Mississippi today, where he's highlighting a different aspect of the president's rhetoric. Take a look at some of what he had to say.
And I just came from El Paso, Texas, where there was literally a massacre of 22 people because of fears of an Hispanic invasion that this president has been warning about and ginning up and talking about infestations and animals and predators and killers. I haven't yet met a killer in this community. These are decent, hardworking people who are contributing to our success. So let's change our laws to reflect that.
And one of our ABC News political reporters, Jeff Cook, joins us now from Canton, Mississippi. And tell us why Beto O'Rourke is campaigning in Mississippi, not a state that's typically on the primary schedule.
Yeah, we just heard former Texas Congressman Beto O'Rourke talk about fears, and we heard some very real fears here in Canton, Mississippi, where he made his first campaign stop. You would think that maybe somebody who's been off the trail for a while might go to Iowa or New Hampshire, but as we said, he's here in Mississippi, where there's a serious fear after ICE raids detained several hundred people in this area, many of whom just right down the street at a food processing plant. This market behind me is exactly where Beto O'Rourke visited. He spoke with some families who did not want to speak on camera in fear for their own safety because they are undocumented. He spoke to a family whose the mother is currently detained. The child and her father was here, and they were talking about how this market is kind of a centerpiece to this community, and if with fear of that the immigrants have here, and they're afraid to go outside and they're afraid to shop, and they're afraid that this entire community could be in real harm, not just the immigrants and the entire community here surrounding this center here.
And Jeff, you've spent about 2 weeks straight in El Paso covering Beto O'Rourke, as well as all of the memorial services and the reaction and the aftermath of the shooting. You were one of the first reporters to get on the scene 2 weekends ago. I'm curious your thoughts of how Beto O'Rourke has processed this and how he views his role now. He has talked a lot about being changed by the events in El Paso and wanting to change his campaign in fitting with that.
That's right. He has mixed no words about going after the president and for what he believes is causing an enormous amount of harm on this country and communities like Mississippi and communities like El Paso, where the attacker cited anti-immigrant rhetoric in his motivation for the attack. He says that he needs that he and his supporters need to take on Trump directly and not mince any words about where these attacks are coming from.
All right, Jeff Cook, we appreciate you joining us from the trail there in Mississippi. Want to flip a little north to Georgia, to Atlanta, where a number of presidential candidates have been convening today for the Young Leadership Conference targeting African-American voters, young African-American voters in particular. Among the candidates to speak earlier today, Julian Castro, another Texan who has been impacted personally by the attacks of a couple weeks ago and has a kind of rejuvenated message in his campaign. Take a look.
Well, as you know, the first thing that we need to do is get the white nationalist that is currently in the Oval Office out of the Oval Office.
And that marks the first time that the only Latino candidate in the race, the former HUD Secretary Julian Castro, has actually explicitly called President Trump a white nationalist. Other candidates, including Beto O'Rourke, have also gone there in recent days. We're joined now by Sasha Pezenik, another ABC News reporter covering the 2020 candidates. And Sasha, what else have we heard from candidates at this forum in Atlanta?
Yeah, that's right. It was an absolute explosion from the room when Julian Castro said that. It was they all stood to their feet and really seemed excited about it. And the other things that were getting people revved up today was the sort of idea of moral virtue being restored in America, where it is missing from the current White House. There was a lot of energy in the room for Julian Castro for that moment, as well as for Cory Booker. He was citing scripture, doing call and answer with the crowd, and saying that this is a time to put your faith towards action. Christ doesn't sit on the couch, and neither should you.
And Sasha, you've been covering the campaign now for months. Have you noticed the change in the tenor of the candidates, as well as the people that gather to see the candidates speak in the wake of the El Paso shooting?
Yeah, definitely. I think that there's been a lot more of a focus on gun control and bringing the country together in a different way that we haven't really seen before. It's often been a third rail in politics, especially for the Democratic Party. And we sort of see a tidal shift in this moment now, where we use El Paso, or on the stump, candidates are using El Paso as a symbol of what we can't do anymore in America and what we need to put our efforts towards now, if that makes any sense.
It does make a lot of sense. And Sasha Pezenik, we appreciate you joining us and from the campaign trail. Stay safe out there. We always appreciate the entire team checking in with us here in the briefing room. And I should note that things are going to get serious pretty fast in this presidential race. Julian Castro, among the candidates who have not yet qualified for the next presidential debate, that will be held in about a month's time, September 12th and 13th, if necessary, in Houston, Texas. ABC News will broadcast that debate. And there are a number of candidates who are on the cusp of not making the cut. They need some new polls to come in, and they need them fast. They only have about another week and a half to meet that deadline. That does it for today's edition of The Briefing Room. I'm ABC News political director Rick Klein. Download the ABC News app and check back with us all day long at abcnews.com. We'll see you next time.